Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen. So in today's episode, I have Kyle from Valley to Peak Nutrition back on the podcast, and he's shining light on a very misunderstood topic in the world of nutrition, and that is fat. And specifically, what the difference is between dietary fat and the fat that you actually eat through your nutrition, and body fat, so the fat that you hold on your body. Now, sometimes these things just get lumped together as the same thing, and I see it all the time in hiking Facebook groups and forums and this and that, but they are very different. So today, Kyle shines a little bit of light on this topic, shares some great insights, and also how this all relates to fueling your energy and fueling your time when you're out on the trail. So, with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and let's get into it. Hey, my name is Rowan Smith, and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast, which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare, and conquer your upcoming hike, trek, or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude, and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable, and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. All right, welcome back to the show, Kyle. Really stoked to have you back involved.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. It's been a while. We did a couple of these earlier on, and pumped to be back. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. Well, it has been a while. Like, it's really time flies. Like, because we're obviously chatting a little bit here and there, but I didn't realize how long it's been since you've been on the podcast. But for anyone who hasn't listened to the previous episodes before, Kyle is a dietitian. He runs Valley to Peak Nutrition, and he specializes in working with hikers, backpackers, and trail athletes. And he's done a couple of great episodes on different topics of nutrition. So I think we previously talked about some basics of nutrition. I think we talked about keto at some stage. I think we had a couple other topics. Can't even remember. It's been so long, But yeah, great to have you back in action. And sort of today, what we are diving into and what we're talking about is a topic that it's come up in the Summit Strength sphere a few times recently, and I think it's something that just gets absolutely butchered out there online. So many people talk about it. So many people don't really know what they're talking about. And I think it'll be a really good one just to shine a bit of light on clarity, is talking about fat. And specifically, we're talking about the difference between your body fat and sort of what you actually hold on your body, and actual dietary fat, and the fat that you may see in foods and burgers and fish and all of that jazz. And sometimes they get lumped in the same thing, and they're obviously, well, hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll sort of it will be obvious that they are a little bit different. So we're going to be diving into this. So I think it'll be really interesting. So yeah, Kyle, I think on that note, I'll let you take it away, riff a little bit on this subject. I think there's going to be lots of information, and then tell us your thoughts on this and how you would go about explaining it all.
Yeah, so good question, and really good lead in and preface to that, because you're right, it is largely misunderstood. And again, I think I've said this either several times on the episodes that we've done, or in the Summit Strength Q&A, the lives, or even on our podcast. My qualms with misinformation about nutrition isn't that people trust it, because honestly, I think the average person who doesn't understand nutrition goes to seek and find information trying to do better. My qualm is with people who project themselves as an expert and give really bad information. And so, to your point, yes, there is a lot of really bad misinformation on the topic. And really what I think people want to know when this question comes up is, can fat be used as fuel, right? And so that is really the underlying question that a lot of people want. Is it's like, okay, well, I keep hearing that fat is this better fuel source than carbohydrate, particularly on endurance fit events. What truth is there in that? And we'll look at that, obviously, but the distinction between stored body fat, and that definition is going to be pretty obvious, and dietary fat is quite simple. Dietary fat is simply the fat that you eat, right? And so there is a number of foods out there that have some fat to them, but then there's like a subcategory that have predominantly fat. And when we say that, we're saying these foods of the calories that are in these foods, a very, very large percentage of these calories are coming from fat. So you could take one end of that spectrum, which would be oils, olive oils, canola oil, coconut oil, whatever you want to call it. That's 100% of the calories are coming from fat. That's the higher end of the spectrum. And then you could take something like eggs or whole milk, where you've got, let's call it 60, 70% of the calories coming from fat. So sometimes things are 100%, sometimes things are in the middle, sometimes things are low end of things, but dietary fat is by and large stuff that you're eating to get fat into you. Stored body fat is different, right? Obviously, that's the body fat that you store, whether you like it or you don't. We generally have two categories of that. One is subcutaneous, that's just below the surface of the skin. And then the other is visceral, which is the stuff around the organs that we usually say that's really the stuff you kind of want to get rid of in terms of long-term health. So then it starts to transition into this subject of fat as fuel, right? And the greatest misconception, I would say, without question, is that if I eat a really high fat diet, I'm going to be, quote, fat adapted, and therefore I'll be using fat as fuel, which means I don't need to fuel as long. It'll give me the ability to go longer for further without having to fuel up as often. And that simply is not true. The type of fat that's used as fuel for endurance-based events, and I would highly encourage you to listen to all of this podcast before just shutting it off to really get a full understanding of what we're talking about. But the type of fat that is used in these long endurance events is predominantly stored fat, right? So it's fat that you've previously eaten from extra calories you already have or what have you, but it's not like you drink a shot of olive oil on the trail and immediately start using that as fuel. It's a much longer process than that. And so I think that is probably the biggest misnomer on the topic when you look at it that people have questions on.
Yeah, yeah, and it's an interesting one because I know for myself, I'm always a bit of a sticky beak in different Facebook groups, and I like sort of watching what's going on, and particularly in like the ultralight backpacking Facebook groups or like the PCT ones or whatever it may be. And people are asking sort of topics about how should I fuel and this and that, and there's always the people like, hey, yeah, bring all this olive oil and just sip on that on the trail. That'll give you all these calories and that'll burn like you're burning fat as you go through. Or there's like the classic, not so much on the longer distance trails, but the bulletproof coffee where you like have coffee and put a stick of butter in it. And they're like, yeah, you're going to be using all of that fat to fuel your energy. So it's an interesting one. And I think it's very, very interesting getting that divide. So just out of curiosity on that then, and this may be getting a little bit technical, but here we go. See how you go with this. Is the process of converting that extra calories that you mentioned. So you're sort of like, taking an extra calorie, this and that. The actual process of that turning into fat, what does that actually look like, that stored fat? You said it was obviously a longer process, but what are the sort of steps in there?
Yeah, so storing body fat is, at its core, in the most basic sense, excess calorie intake, right? So if you overconsume the amount of calories that you need, the body is going to sense this is an excess, so we are going to store it for later use, like if we need it later or what have you, right? So that conversion can take place through prolonged extra calorie intake. Now, like one of the things that's important to remember is even the leanest of lean has some body fat that they are going to burn. And it ebbs and flows with training. If you're in a high volume of training, you may be using a body fat and you may be leaner, but people take time off, right? I mean, there is recovery seasons where they're not training as much and maybe they put on more body fat. So then when a training season rolls around, that's there again. One of the important distinctions to remember is that fat can be used as fuel. It is a prolonged fuel source. In fact, you could have up to 80,000 calories of stored body fat and only 2,500 calories worth of stored carbohydrate. It doesn't take a mathematician to realize like that's a lot more potential fuel there. But a key thing to remember with that is the muscle, it depends on the intensity of the activity, right? If you come up and you're having to really work hard on an effort, like let's say that you are climbing one of the big 8,000 meter peaks or whatever, and it's a hard effort. You're climbing 1,000 meters every couple of hours or 1,000 feet every couple of hours or what have you. It's a very hard effort. anytime the intensity or the effort of the activity goes up, the body shifts. It starts to rely more on carbohydrates. So if you've not been bringing that in, it's got nothing to fuel. One of the main features, let's call it for lack of better terminology, is that if you're training in a relatively low heart rate zone, one of the great things about training in like a zone 2, which is a moderate type of an effort, is you aren't burning through your carbohydrate stores as much. There is some of that fuel coming from body fat so that it preserves what's in the muscle, the carbohydrate stores in the muscle, so that when you do come up on a hard effort, that gas is in the tank so you can take it on. If you're constantly depleting that and not replacing it, if you're not eating carbohydrate on the trail and you come up on an effort where your intensity swings up, you won't die. You'll still be able to make it up, but the speed in which you do it, the rate at which the muscle contracts is much slower. So we find time and time again, whenever we test people in large study groups, athletes, in other words, we find, yeah, people can still function eating fats and not eating a lot of carbohydrates, but their times are much slower. Their ability to really push the envelope in terms of effort is a lot less. And another piece of that is carbohydrate metabolism naturally fuels the brain. And so you will often hear about people who go on a hike, they hit some sort of a wall, and they just can't mentally work themselves through it, right? They just don't have the ability to cognitively coach themselves through something difficult. They emotionally break down. And a lot of times that can be preceded by the fact that they've not been fueling anything. If you get a constant drip of fuel to the brain, to the muscle, and you can avoid that wall, the trip will be, much more enjoyable. So it's not to say that if you prefer a higher fat diet that it won't work. It will work. The argument though is your body doesn't know systems. It only knows efforts, right? And it's always going to be operating on different fuel sources. There's always going to be a mix of carbohydrates, fats, and hopefully not proteins very often, but of carbohydrates and fats fueling you to do the effort that you're asking it to do. So it's not to say that you should avoid anything or anything like that, but it's important to remember that there's always a mix of fuels contributing towards that. And if you're not taking in all of those, if you're not taking in carbohydrates and fats, you will eventually hit a wall, right? And that's usually where problems start to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's use this example, and just to have really crystal clarity on kind of what you sort of said today, because I know sometimes these topics are really interesting, that sometimes it just takes a few different angles to kind of sink in. So Yep. Let's say a hiker is going out for a long hike or whatever it may be, and they, for their snacks, they've decided, look, I'm going to pack a bunch of, let's say, nuts, a bunch of nuts. And let's just say nuts. That's an easy thing. High fat, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And they're kind of snacking on that as they go through. And in their head, they're thinking, okay, I've heard that, when I'm going at this lower intensity, I'm mostly burning fat, and I'm snacking and I'm eating. But what's actually going on is, yes, they are snacking. They're eating this dietary fat. But as they're sort of hiking along, that dietary fat's going to the body. It's getting consumed, but they're actually fueling their energy with the body fat. Is that the sequence of events? Is that pretty correct there? Is anything missing
Yes.
from that?
Now, yes. And to dive even a little bit deeper into that is the sequence of events. The food will eventually process, but the time period from consumption to conversion into usable fuel is very long, right? That's one of the major problems with it. Now, if that's one of the major problems with fueling only with that, I should say. Let's contrast something that's completely opposite, like gummy bears, right? We always talk about gummy bears or an electrolyte powder or whatever. The time that takes to convert from food consumed into usable fuel that basically drives you up the mountain or down the trail is nearly instantaneous. And so when you're doing a hard effort, when you see a really big obstacle in your way, when you see a challenge up ahead of you, and we're talking about, oh, we'll consume this, and everybody's like, well, my gosh, that just violates every nutrition thing on the planet. Why do you say that? It's because it's like a jolt of energy straight to you to get you up the mountain. The other piece of that is, like, let's use the example that you used, the hiker going down the trail. He or she is eating almonds and nuts. That will provide some fuel, right? And so they will be able to continue hiking, but they won't be nearly as fast, and the effort will seem much more arduous, especially if it's an intense endeavor that they're trying to take on. And I'll give you an example in a minute, but a key thing to remember about dietary fat is this, and let's take almonds as an example. Yes, a vast majority of the calories in an almond is from fat, but there is some carbohydrate. So when you eat that, the body is basically sensing, okay, well, here's some fat, and we're going to process that, and eventually we'll get around to converting it to energy. But it's also got about 6 grams of carbohydrate per 1 ounce, almonds do. And by comparison, 16 grams of fat. So it still takes that 6 grams and gives you some energy much quicker than it would from the dietary fat. This goes back, I think, to your question about the metabolism of it. When you're hiking, when you're active, when you're whatever, and you're breaking down dietary fat, it goes from being a whole fat into separate parts. One of those parts goes to the liver to provide carbohydrate, glycerol, right? So even when you're breaking down body fat, you're still getting some carbohydrate. And that's the irony and the sort of the funny thing about the body is, like, you can't outsmart it. You could be as carbohydrate free as you wanted to, but even stored body fat is going to break off some carbohydrate to give your brain some fuel. Yes, you could operate off of ketones as an alternative, and you can listen to our other podcasts if you want to dive in more to that. But the body's always got a preference, right? And so if you're making it work harder for its preference, then I suppose that's your choice. But it makes more sense to me just to fuel right, and to give your body what it needs. But anyway, yeah. So I told you earlier I'd give you an example. I just spoke to a guy, he wasn't a client, his wife was, but he had just went on they just went on some peak bagging trips over here in the western U.S. He has a buddy who's in much better condition than he is. He says he just trains more. This guy's still in great condition, but his buddy is even just a different level. And on the trail, the gentleman that I knew was mostly eating while he was trying to ascend some of these peaks: gummy bears, gummy worms, electrolyte sticks, all the things that we always talk about that are high in carbohydrate. His buddy was eating mostly beef jerky and cheese, higher fat foods. So even though this guy's condition was better than the gentleman who was eating carbohydrate, he said that, and this is a very key point, he said that at about 2 hours into one of their really long ascents, his body just fell off. He could keep going, but he was much slower. And that is just a great example to show you by comparison how carbohydrates can work versus how fat can work. The guy who was eating mostly fat and proteins, he had a reserve in his muscle, but that reserve was smoked after 2 hours. It's gone. And if he's not replacing that, it's gone. So the body's going to find an alternative way to keep him going, yes, but not at the same relative intensity and effort and, frankly, enjoyment that he had found in those first 2 hours. And that's where the gentleman that I knew sort of stood on top. Was he recognized, look, these sources are limited. I'm going to have to continue to replace them if I want to expect the same effort out of myself all the way to the top. And I think that that's a good difference between looking at fueling with fat and fueling with carbohydrate.
Absolutely, and that actually brings to mind a personal anecdote of myself, in the sense that kind of typically when I go about my training processes, if I have a big hike that I'm prepping for, and I've sort of got, like, say, 12 weeks leading up to it, in the early stages of, like, my training hikes, when the training hike's pretty easy, pretty, like, not too big a deal, I love to fuel my hikes, and not fuel, but just eat on my hikes, is salami and cheese. because these are two foods that I'm not allowed in the house because I just absolutely just have no off switch. So that's my excuse. I use it on the hike and I'm just like, boom, salami and cheese, salami and cheese, salami and cheese. And, it sits in my stomach a bit. I don't feel amazing on the trail, but they're shorter hikes and whatever it may be. And there always comes to a point where I'm like, all right, I'm taking my training a little bit more seriously. Like pack weight's getting a little bit heavier or hikes get a little more difficult. And I make that intentional transition from, all right, no more going overboard on these two heavier things. I'm going to sort of start to what do you recommend? A little bit more high carbohydrates, get into the dried fruit, get into the snakes, get into this and that. And just night and day in regards to my own energy, like on those. And I'm just feel quicker, feel a bit lighter, I can exert myself. Obviously things don't sit in my stomach so much. And yeah, just sprang to mind there. Like that's actually an example of myself that, just that shift away. Yeah, it definitely makes a bit of a difference there. But there you go. So on this topic, then I think we've covered a few good key points. And in all honesty, I think someone could listen to this 3 or 4 times because there's been a lot of good stuff in there, which I think probably needs re-listening a few times for a few people because it's a very interesting subject. But is there anything we haven't really covered today so far that you think is worthwhile touching on or talking about or anything like that at all?
No, so I would agree. I mean, I would agree. Go back and listen to it multiple times. Honestly, sometimes it can be a challenge to even talk about because you're trying to remember all of the different processes at a bit of a deeper level. I would agree with you 100%. Go back and re-listen to some of those things, and feel free to reach out if you have questions. I'd be glad to answer it. There is a lot of information, especially in Facebook groups and podcasts and all over the place about, kind of quote, becoming fat adapted, which eludes this idea that somehow you can improve your ability to utilize fat as a fuel. And that is possible, right? We do know that when a person is consuming less carbohydrate and consuming more fat, the body is naturally going to begin using whatever is more available as a fuel. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you're going to get better. It just means that it's going to use that as a fuel. But a couple of things to keep in mind, like, so to increase that, like I said, you have to reduce the amount of carbohydrate that you're eating, increase the amount of fat, sometimes train fasted, etc. But you have to understand that if you try to go that route, there's two major compromises you're making. Number one, training may not improve at all, right? If you're trying to lower carbohydrate and you find yourself trying to become more fat adapted, a potential negative consequence of that is training performance goes down, times go down, ability to carry weight goes down, time to ascent, the amount of time that it takes you to climb 1,000 feet goes down. Those things could potentially, be a byproduct of that. Second thing, and the one thing that no one ever talks about, is what's really popular, especially like in the ultra trail running community, is I eat high fat, low carb during my week, but whenever I show up to the race or a training run, then I eat more carbohydrate. My body just soaks them up. It does soak them up, but we know that whenever you are not regularly consuming carbohydrate, your body is not able to metabolize them as sufficiently when exposed. So in other words, if you're following a low carb diet and then all of a sudden you try to incorporate them, it's not going to be able to turn those over as though you were just eating normally throughout the course of the week with carbs too. You have a poorer ability to convert those. So there are consequences to that. And again, the body is so intelligent, right? There are no on-off switches. It doesn't recognize, it doesn't recognize systems. It just recognizes efforts. And there is always going to be a contribution of multiple fuels based on intensity when you're hiking. The best thing you can do is just be in a constant replacement of those throughout the course of the hike or the training run or whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point as well, I think that one thing that never gets talked about when we're talking about this fat adaptation, and it's something that I just think is so relevant, is one of the things that can actually help with that. You talked about fasting or low carb and this and that, and obviously there's consequences or benefits for people who, it's always the trail runners or the through hikers or whatever. But one of the big things that goes into that is, a well-structured aerobic training program of following progression, following consistency, doing all the right things. That plays a big role in this as well. And a lot of people just overlook it. Because I would sort of say 95% of hikers, or even 98% of hikers and mountaineers I talk to, they have massive potential for improvement in regards to their actual just training program and having a bit more
Yeah.
consistency, a bit more progression. And that'll probably see them results without having to have the restrictions or whatever it may be. So it's something that always gets overlooked, but I think it's such an important thing because there's so much potential there for so many benefits with very few drawbacks. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think I think the best thing that a person could do if they wanted to improve their fuel economy, right? They wanted to be able to stretch their fuel out longer, is to be trained. The more trained you are, the easier an effort's going to feel, the less fuel you're burning through, the longer you can go between fueling sessions, right? And the best thing you could do from a fuel economy standpoint is to be well trained and be a part of a good aerobic base system. Because you're right, we talked about this earlier, is that zone 2 training, that mild effort for, and if you're training, that gets better over time. One of the keys to that is you're not torching through your carbohydrate stores in your muscle. They are lasting longer because what used to be a difficult effort for you now seems mediocre at best. And so you're preserving a lot of that fuel for a longer period of time. So yes, to your point, I agree with you 100%.
yeah, absolutely. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Well, I feel like we covered quite a bit today, which has been great. And obviously, the world of nutrition. For anyone listening, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of information that goes into it, and I think that really leads into the last thing I kind of want to touch on. And I would love if you could just take a few moments just to talk about your nutrition foundations course, because it's an awesome product. I've got a few of my clients going through it who absolutely love it. Great things to say. And I think it really, really, really is for anyone who's interested in this type of stuff. I think it'd be a great thing to hear about. So if you could just give us a bit of a rundown, what is it, what it's all about, how can people find it? Talk us through it.
Yeah, so we've built, we've got several different options for people who really want to take a deep dive and just sort of take the time to understand nutrition better. And by deep dive, I mean just look at this, because Foundations is named Foundations because I wanted it to be simple to understand, but explainable. Because for me, the number one thing that people could have is autonomy, is an understanding of nutrition to guide their own decisions based on whatever it is that they want to pursue. So Foundations is 20 weeks long, covering 20 different topics of nutrition that I've learned over the years that I've done this seem to be the most confusing for people. And those, run the gamut from understanding calories and how to adjust calories, when to adjust calories, when to adjust your macros, how much protein do you need based on training, what about carbohydrate fueling and fat, and just runs the gamut of different topics. If people want to look more at that, we've got tip sheets that we've developed, and we just developed a number of things. And so I would say Foundations is a really great way if you're just starting to dip a toe into the water of nutrition and understanding it, to introduce that. You're uncertain if you want to do a one-on-one coaching program that might seem like too big of a time commitment or a financial investment or whatever. Foundations sort of meets you in the middle, right? And again, it just highlights all of those different topics that are all aimed at helping you make better decisions to fuel your time on the trail. And if you, it's on our website, so v2pnutrition.com/course, I believe is it. But if you just go to v2pnutrition.com, there's a tab up at the top of the page that has a link to that. Click that, and it will guide you on how to look at what the topics are, so you can look at all the topics before you commit to purchasing it. You get lifetime access when you do purchase it. There are, in addition to each of the videos, there are a number of different downloads that you can access. And again, you get lifetime access to all of that, and download it, print it, do whatever you want with it. The main goal for me in creating that was to help people get a really good understanding of nutrition at a price point that I felt like was approachable for anybody.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, like I've had a few of my hikers go through it, and they've got really, really great things to say. So for anyone who's interested in checking out, like learning a bit more about nutrition, I would highly recommend it. So for those links, I'll leave those links in the show notes below. So anyone wants to check it out, you can just scroll down below and click through there. But I think today's been fantastic, Kyle. Thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate you having a bit of time and exploring this topic. If anyone has any questions from this episode, please do reach out and let us know. But aside from that, thanks for so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ron. I appreciate it.